So this is a new paper that I've been recently working on, and in a way it's a bit of a kind of change from some of the topics that we have been discussing this morning, because it's not really on Kant theory of matter, which is something that I'm very keen on and something I've explored elsewhere, but it's part of this project for which this colloquium is actually is part of, namely to explore Kant's view on the laws of nature. So this is what I'm planning to do in the paper. In the paper I address Kant's view about what is a law of nature and what makes nature lawful. And Kant's view is famously captured by passages of the Prolegomena and the second edition of the Critical Pure Reason, where Kant seems to suggest that the lawfulness of nature, the fact that we encounter nature as full of laws, seems to be the product of our faculty of understanding, prescribing and imposing laws to nature. So that's what the title, Prescribing Laws to Nature. So did Kant subscribe to a governing conception of laws? And how should such a governing conception of laws be characterized? So this is the topic of my paper today. What I'm planning to do is to clarify three main points about Kant's view on this issue. So first I want to clarify what is at stake in a governing conception of laws. Second, I want to elucidate the background against which Kant came to elaborate his governing conception of laws back to Isaac Newton and his legacy for Kant. So in a way I'll be talking about the interaction between Newton and Kant, but not on the theme of attraction and repulsion or matter, but on the theme about Newton's view of the laws of nature, what makes something a law of nature. And I will be arguing that Kant was elaborating his view about laws of nature against the background of Newton's view. And third, I'm going to focus on how the young Kant, again, the precritical Kant, came to articulate this view about the lawfulness of nature in a 1763 text called The Only Possible Argument in support of the demonstration of the existence of God. So I'm going to be arguing in the end that Kant's early view provides a solution to three problems that I think he found in Newton's governing conception of law. Okay, so what is a governing conception of laws then? Well, in contemporary terms, really in terms of contemporary philosophy of science, the governing conception of laws take its cue from the anti-Humean intuition that there is something really special about laws. When we say that something is a law of nature, we mean that there is something special over and above mere regularity. So laws are not descriptions of states of affairs. Laws are not honorific titles for empirical patterns of events in nature. Key to the governing conception is the intuition that laws have a prescriptive role or a distinctive nomological force. Laws prescribe or govern the way nature ought to be. So the analogy here is with jurisprudence, where laws are prescriptive and they're meant to govern society and codify acceptable norms of social behavior, rather than being mere descriptions of factual matters about institutional arrangements. So in jurisprudence, the prescriptive force of laws emanates from some recognized authority that exercises its ruling power, and breaking the laws involves sanctions and punishments. But how do laws govern nature, and what makes of a law of nature something that has a prescriptive force? Well, there seems to be three key ideas involved in the governing conception of laws. Well, to start with, if laws govern, then there must be a lawgiver who enforces them. So although Humeans may retort that it's not a conceptual truth, that laws presuppose a lawgiver, it is certainly such under the governing conception of laws, and also for good historical reasons, I think. Second, laws seems to govern by prescribing rather than describing the way nature ought to behave. And finally, laws prescribe by necessitating states of affairs in nature. So this third aspect, I think, is paramount to any governing conception of laws in contemporary terms. What is distinctive of laws, be they laws in jurisprudence or laws of nature under the governing account, is their ability to enforce and necessitate the way things ought to be. So the necessity that comes along with laws, or that is distinctive of laws, takes the name of nomological necessity and is usually regarded as accomplishing two distinct jobs. Nomological necessity is primarily meant to track some physical necessity in nature. So laws of nature govern or necessitate by capturing physical necessities in nature. For example, one may say that Coulomb's law governs electrostatic phenomena by capturing a physically necessary behavior of electric charges. Now, how to understand the relation between the governing laws and the physically necessary states of affairs varies from one strand to the other of the governing conception. So, for example, the standard necessitarian view that is associated in contemporary terms with people like David Armstrong, Fred Dresky, Michael Tooley, sees physical necessity as a top-down instantiation of laws of nature understood as necessitation relations between universal properties. So it's physically necessary that Fa is GA is meant to be an instantiation of the laws that says that the universal property Fness necessitates or brings along with it the property Gness. But if you are a dispositional essentialist, on the other hand, you would say that physical necessity comes first and is grounded in nature's capacities and causal powers from which laws of nature are read off. So there are these two approaches in contemporary terms. One is top-down, is the necessitarian one. The other one is the dispositional essentialist one. So the dispositional essentialist would say that the nomological necessity of Coulomb's law is grounded on the physical necessity with which, say, a point-like electric charge has a power to attract or repel another point-like electric charge of opposite sign. So either way, top-down or bottom-up, under the governing conception of laws in contemporary terms, nomological necessity traces physical necessity in nature. The second job of nomological necessity is typically to explain the occurrence of events. So nomological necessity is explanatory. Laws explain why the next observed Fa is bound to be Ga in virtue of the necessary connection between F and G. So by forsaking physical necessity, Humeans seems to be saddled with the problem of explaining why the next observed emerald is likely to be green, or why the next observed electric charge is likely to attract an electric charge of opposite sign. In other words, by capturing physical necessity in nature, a governing conception of law can explain why the collections of past observed occurrences of Fa, which are Ga, provides also reasons for explaining and predicting that the next Fb we will observe is bound to be Gb, Pache-Hume's problem of induction. Okay, so you may be wondering, what about Kant or what about Newton? Contemporary discussions on the governing conception of laws shows at best the far-reaching legacy and importance of the topic that I think Kant and Newton in their own terms engage with. But obviously they don't begin to show that Kant employed or shared the conceptual tools that we associate with contemporary governing conception of laws. So was there any governing conception of laws at Kant's time? And what were its distinctive features? So in what follows, I argue that the young pre-critical Kant grappled with the specific governing conception of laws offered by Newton and with some of its philosophical problems. In 1763, Kant gave his own solutions to these problems, and Kant's solution borrows a key metaphysical notion, the notion of ground, from Wolff, to provide ultimately a bottom-up account of the necessity of the law as grounded in natural forces and their determination. So this is the line that I'm going to be suggesting. So while the key metaphysical notion is borrowed from the Wolffian tradition, Newton's natural philosophy provided once more the template for Kant's view. So this is the kind of trailer of what's next. Okay. So Newton's governing conception of laws. Now, the laws presuppose a lawgiver, as I said, may not be a conceptual truth, as Alan Beebe rightly says, but it is a historical truth. The governing conception of laws emerged with the scientific revolution and with the philosophical reflections that accompany it. And a quick look at two key figures in this trend, Descartes and Newton, soon reveals that, like its contemporary version, the early modern version too shares the three aforementioned points about a lawgiver, prescribing and necessitating with some suitable provisos. So the first proviso is that, by contrast with the contemporary version, there is no doubt that the early modern version has theistic origin in the idea of God as a lawgiver imposing an order on nature. So take Descartes, who in the Principles of Philosophy declared that God created matter with motion and rest, and, quote, since he moved in several different ways the particles of matter when he created them, and since he maintains all of them in the same way and with the same laws that he made them observe through their creation, he incessantly conserves an equal quantity of movement in matter, end quote. Even more poignantly, quote, please don't hesitate to assert and proclaim everywhere that it is God who has laid down these laws in nature, just as a king lays down laws in his kingdom, end of quote. Or, moving to Newton, consider Coates' preface to Newton's Principia, and there you have it in your handout. I'm going to help myself with a copy of it. So this is a first quote in your handout from Coates' preface to the Principia, where he says, this world, so beautifully diversified in its forms and motions, could not have arisen except from the perfectly free will of God, who provides and governs all things. From this source, then, have all the laws that are called the laws of nature come, in which many traces of the highest wisdom and counsel certainly appear, but no traces of necessity. Accordingly, we shouldn't seek these laws by using untrustworthy conjectures, but learn them by observing and experimenting. He who is confident that can truly find the principles of physics and the laws of things by relying only on the force alone of his mind and the internal light of his reason should maintain either that the world has existed from necessity and follows the said laws from the same necessity, or that although the order of nature was constituted by the will of God, nevertheless a creature as small and as insignificant as he is, has a clear understanding of the way things should be. So Coates seems to suggest here that the necessity of the laws cannot follow from the necessity of the world itself, nor be accessed by the force alone of one's own mind. Instead, the laws follow from the order of nature established by God himself as the perfect lawgiver acting with wisdom and providence towards his creation. No wonder Newton in the Principia used the verb to govern in relation to God and laws of nature. God governs and knows all things that are or can be done, and that the motion of comets are said to be governed by the same laws with the motion of the planets. Newton believed also that the laws of motion could be inferred or deduced from phenomena by observation and experiments. So in no way did Newton regard our knowledge of the laws as dependent upon metaphysical or theistic assumptions. However, Newton did regard the prescribing force of the laws as originating from theistic assumptions. Newton was critical of the Cartesian idea that sheer mechanical causes could originate motions, as he was skeptical of the idea that laws of nature per se could explain what set planets and comets in motion. Instead, for Newton, the source of the lawfulness of nature had to be found in what he called the biblical Lord God Pantocrator. Nature, with all its mathematically demonstrable forces and laws, is ultimately the dominion of God. So in the General Scholium, this is what Newton writes, is the second quote on your handout. It says, all bodies will indeed persevere in their orbits by the laws of gravity, but they certainly could not originally have acquired the regular position of the orbits by these laws. This most elegant system of the sun, planets and comets could not have arisen without the design and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. He rules all things, not as the world's soul, but as the Lord of all, and because of his dominion, he is called Lord God Pantocrator. So laws of nature originate from the deliberation and free choice of a universal ruler. Newton laid the foundations, I want to suggest, of a governing conception of laws, which proved very influential in the centuries to come. The necessity of the laws, the necessity through which Newton's laws prescribe orbital motion, ultimately derives from and depends upon God. Laws prescribe nature only to the extent that God has freely established them to rule his dominion. Yet Newton's account left open three important questions, which not surprisingly became the battleground for philosophical disputes in the following decades. So the first problem is what I'm going to call the problem of nomological necessity. Laws of nature enjoy a special status because they originate directly from God's free choice and God's deliberation. But if their nomological necessity is, so to speak, derivative from God's free choice and deliberation, how could laws by themselves, without resorting to God, genuinely prescribe the way nature ought to be. So there is a sense in which the prescribing or prescriptive force of the laws is really parasitic upon God's free choice and deliberation. Laws by themselves don't seem to have a genuine prescribing power, which is not what one would expect from a genuine governing conception of laws. Second problem is the problem of explicability. The universality and immutability of the laws, under Newton's account, seems to capture universal and immutable relational properties among material objects. So the law of gravity captures how the force of gravity is inversely proportional to the square of the distance between any two material bodies. That inverse square law, that inverse square relation, is what is immutable and universal about Newton's law. But the Newtonian account, please correct me if I'm wrong, because this is my opportunity to test my speculations upon Newton. The Newtonian account doesn't tell us much about what one might call the intrinsic, monadic properties that presumably ground such relational properties. No wonder Leibniz retorted that the operations of the force of gravity were miraculous, absurd, or simply obscure. So we have a nice quote here from the Leibniz-Clark correspondence, Leibniz's fifth paper, where Leibniz says, "In good philosophy and sound theology, we ought to distinguish between what's explicable by the natures and powers of creatures and what's explicable only by the powers of the infinite substance. We ought to make an infinite difference between the operation of God, which goes beyond the extent of natural powers, and the operation of things that follow the law which God has given them, and which he has enabled them to follow by their natural power, though not without his assistance. This overthrows attraction, properly so called, and other operations inexplicable by the natural powers of creatures, which kind of operations the assertors of them must suppose to be effected by miracles, or else have recourse to absurdity, that is, to the occult quality of the schools, as we just heard this morning from Thomas." So that was the other problem with the Newtonian account, that effectively the laws don't seem to be explanatory precisely for these reasons. Newton's laws provide an analysis of the relational, immutable properties of objects, but they don't tell us much about intrinsic monadic property that may ground those relational properties. So hence the accusation of the laws being miraculous or obscure. There's a third problem, which I'm going to call the problem of unity. Newton refused to enter metaphysical discussions about the cause of gravity and repeatedly denied that gravity was an essential or an inherent property of matter. I'm not going to repeat what John just said in his talk, by contrast with inertia. In so doing, Newton provided only a mathematical nor a metaphysical account of gravity, and to the eyes of many contemporaries of Newton, as we heard also from Thomas this morning, a metaphysical account was needed to provide unity to what would otherwise be only a contingent aggregate of phenomena subject to gravity. So what brings together the ocean tides, the free fall, the planetary motion, what confers unity to that wide range of different phenomena. So those were the three problems that I think Newton's account left wide open. And what I'm going to do in the following section is to argue that the young Kant grappled with those questions about laws of nature and the governing role left open by Newton, and by the ensuing debate between Leibniz and Newton. And in 1763, the young Kant gave some provisional solutions to these three problems by trying to reconcile the role of God as a supreme lawgiver and the ultimate source of the order of nature with the metaphysical Wolffian idea of necessary connections explicated in terms of grounds and determinations. So moving to section 3. The 1763 essay, the only possible argument in support of a demonstration of the existence of God, is one of the very first texts where I could find a young Kant offering a philosophical analysis of the laws of nature, their governing role, and nomological necessity. By that time, by 1763, Kant had already abundantly engaged with the Newtonian natural philosophy and its fundamental principles and laws, both in universal natural history in 1755, in physical monadology, 1756, alongside other short essays in natural science of the period, such as On Fire of 1755, couple of texts on the rotation of the Earth and the age of the Earth in 1754, 3 short notes on earthquakes, 1756, a theory of the wind, 1756, and most famously, the new doctrine of motion and rest in 1758. So while familiar with Newton's natural philosophy and its fundamental principles of repulsion and attraction, before 1763, Kant had not really engaged directly with Newton's conception of laws. So the 1763 essay provided a perfect occasion for it. And in the third reflection, Kant tackled directly the issue of how things in the world depend on God via the order of nature that God has established. So this is your third quote in your handout, where Kant says, "Something is subsumed under the order of nature if its existence or its alteration is sufficiently grounded in the forces of nature. The first requirement for this is that the force of nature should be the efficient cause of the thing. The second requirement is that the manner in which the force of nature is directed to the production of this effect should itself be sufficiently grounded in a rule of the natural laws of causality. Such events are also called, quite simply, natural events of the world." So natural events are those whose efficient causes are forces of nature, which in turn produce their effects according to what Kant called the natural laws of causality. Kant phrases the whole passage in terms of events being sufficiently grounded in forces and the force-effect relation being sufficiently grounded in the laws of causality. This terminology I don't think is random. I think it's very carefully chosen, as I will explain below, and betrays a subtle philosophical point that is key to my analysis. Namely that Kant introduces forces of nature and the laws of causality to distinguish natural events from supernatural ones, which are such that either their cause is not grounded in the forces of nature, or the force-effect relation is not grounded in a rule of nature itself. This distinction between natural and supernatural events is functional to show how events such as earthquakes, hurricanes, tempests, which had occasionally been invoked as God's punishment on the vicious deeds of a particular town or population, should in fact be regarded as misfortune, Kant claims, because, quote, "Man's conduct cannot be the cause of an earthquake according to a natural law, for there is no connection here between the cause and the effect," between the vicious deeds of a population and the earthquake striking. However, Kant soon rectifies, quote, "If the earthquake is to be regarded as a punishment, then it follows that since these forces of nature cannot, according to any natural law, have any connection with the conduct of man, they must in each individual case be especially instituted by the Supreme Being, and then the event is supernatural in the formal sense of the word, even though the intermediate cause of the event was a force of nature." So the intuition is, if there is an earthquake that destroys a town, we should think of that event as supernatural, although the cause may be natural, maybe just winds that might have caused a tempest, a tsunami, or other. But we should regard the cause-effect relation as being supernatural, as being instituted by the direct intervention of God Himself. So starting with the Newtonian template of God as a supreme lawgiver, while also engaging obviously with Leibnizian theodicy, which is pretty much in the background of those passages, Kant teases out 3 distinct notions in this passage. First, that the order of nature includes only natural events, not supernatural ones. 2, the natural events are events grounded, that's how it defines them, are events grounded in forces of nature, qua causes, and obey the natural laws of causality in the force-effect production. And third, God could ad hoc institute forces of nature to produce devastating effects, such as earthquakes or others, as a punishment, but this would be a supernatural event via natural causes, because it would violate universal natural laws. Now, I'm not going to press here the point about Leibniz theodicy, which is, I think, obvious in this discussion about supernatural events, because I'm more interested in this context in understanding how Kant envisaged the order of nature according to the law of causality. So despite the Supreme Being having created the whole arrangement of things and events in the world and being able to act and intervene supernaturally as needed, the order of nature seems to enjoy a certain degree of metaphysical autonomy in Kant. Laws of nature, especially what he calls the natural laws of causality, govern nature by fixing the way in which forces and their effects, qua grounds and determinations, are related. Any interventions on behalf of God on this order of natural events, whilst possible, would be supernatural for Kant, subject to the immediate divine law, that of the wisdom of God, but in violation to any natural law. Nature, with its lawful unity, is not downstream of the supreme lawgiver, as it becomes even more apparent in Kant's discussion of the necessity that accrues to the order of nature. So we have a quote further down in the same text by Kant, where he says, "All natural things are contingent in their existence, but although the laws of nature, like the things themselves of which they are the laws, accordingly appear to have no necessity, and although again the connections in which these laws can be exercised are contingent, there nonetheless remains a kind of necessity which is very remarkable. There are, namely, many laws of nature of which the unity is necessary." So what is this necessity that accrues to laws of nature taken as a whole? So Kant seems to be saying events are contingent, contingents are the laws, but there seems to be some surprising unity in the overall harmony that we see among different laws of nature. So where does it come from? How can necessity be bestowed on contingent natural events whose lawful connections are themselves only contingent? Well, in my view, Kant's answer to this question relies on the key concept of ground. As Eric Watkins has documented, Kant's discussion about grounds and determination began in Nova Dilucidatio in 1755, where in the context of his discussion of the two new principles of coexistence and succession, Kant identified the essence of a thing with its necessary ground and grappled with the difficult question of explaining how essential and immutable grounds can possibly explain how a substance may change over time. Kant was latching on to the tradition of Wolff and Baumgarten about logical grounds as necessary grounds responsible for the possible essential determinations of things. And he was also introducing, as Eric Watkins has documented, a distinction between logical grounds and real grounds. So in what follow, I take Watkins' analysis of the pre-critical Kant on real grounds on board, and I try to elucidate how in this 1763 text, Kant could give his own solution to the problem of nomological necessity once the link with the Newton Lord God Pantocrator had been severed. So how can the notion of real ground help us answer the above questions about the necessity of the law and the necessary unity of the laws? Kant gives here the example of the elasticity and pressure of the air as the ground of the laws of respiration, but also, quote, of necessity, the ground of the possibility of pumps, of the generation of clouds, of the maintenance of fire, of the winds, and so on. It is necessary that as soon as the ground of even merely one of them be present, the ground of the others should also be present, end of quote. In other words, as soon as we posit the elasticity of the air as a real ground, we necessarily posit also the ground for the generation of clouds, for the maintenance of fire, for the generation of winds, and so on, in Kant's view. So these examples are not surprising. Again, as early as in True Estimation of Living Forces in 1748, Kant had identified elasticity as a true machine of nature whose, quote, physical cause, whatever it may be, can be released and triggered by elastic impact of bodies, end of quote. Following a view which he attributed to the Cartesian Jean-Jacques d'Orthius de Maran in his polemic exchange with Émile du Châtelet in 1740 around Vis Viva. In Universal Natural History, Kant took the key step of associating elasticity with Newton's repulsive force, whereby elasticity, or better, what he called elastic air, was presented as, quote, capable of maintaining the most violent degrees of fire in the atmosphere of the sun. And again, in 1756, Theory of Winds, the cause of the winds was itself identified in the, quote, decrease of the expansive force by cold and vapor that reduced the elasticity of the air. So Kant concludes then in going back to the 1763 essay, that if the ground of the effects of a certain kinds, which are similar according to one law, is not at the same time the ground of effects of a different kind in the same being, according to another law, then the agreement of these laws with each other is contingent. End of quote. And contingent is the unity of the law. In other words, if the ground of one set of effects as given by a law, so the law that explains how the decrease in elasticity causes alteration in the equilibrium of the atmosphere, which results in the winds being produced, were not also the ground for a different kind of effect in the same entity, according to a different law, say the law of combustion that explains how far can be maintained by elastic care, then the unity between these two laws, the laws of combustion and the kind of laws that explains the formation of the winds, would be merely contingent. And contingent would be the order of nature established by those laws. By the same line of reasoning, Kant argued in Universal Natural History that gravity also acts as a ground for a plurality of effects whose unity is necessary. So in the only possible argument, Kant identified gravity as a cause which is of necessity sufficient to produce all these effects, and give the example of the Earth's spherical form, the orbit of the moon, and so forth, as a plurality of effects that are determinations or consequences of positing gravity as a ground. So Kant's conclusion, after all this example of elasticity and gravity, is unequivocal, and you have it on, again, your handout is the final quote, quote 4, where he says, now, the fact that grounds are to be found in nature for all these effects is without doubt a perfection. And if the same ground, which determines the one thing, should also be sufficient to determine the others, then the unity which accrues to the all is so much the greater. But this unity, and along with it the perfection as well, are in the present case necessary, and they attach to the essence of the thing. And all the harmoniousness, fruitfulness, and beauty, which are insofar due to that unity, depend upon God, either through the mediation of the essential order of nature, or through the mediation of that which is necessary in the order of nature. I found this passage quite striking. You find Kant talking about the essence of a thing. You find Kant talking about the essential order of nature. Of course, it's the pre-critical Kant, so it's a Kant that speaks in a way that is very different from the one that we are accustomed to in the critical period. So how can nature constitute a lawful unity despite the contingency of natural events? Well, remember the problems that I mentioned Newton left open, okay, and let's see how Kant now is meant to give an answer to those problems. So recall the problem of the nomological necessity, the necessity of the laws, which was downstream of God as the supreme lawgiver in Newton's conception. Now, Kant could not accept this Newtonian picture for two main reasons I want to suggest. First, it delegates the nomological necessity of the law of gravity to God's free choice, without really being able to explain why F's are G's, why the moons, Jupiter, or any other planets persevere in their orbits, or why the Earth is spherical, and so forth. So is it gravity that necessitates this effect? How should we think of gravity as a force of nature for gravity to govern these effects? The Newtonian view makes nomological necessity parasitic upon God's legislative choice and interventions in nature, and as such not only deprives gravity of its prescriptive force, it also makes the effects due to gravity inexplicable in the light of the laws of gravity itself. And then remember the problem of explicability. Again, here we are reminded of Leibniz's warning of not to confuse the operation of God with the operations of the things that follow the laws that God has given them and which he has enabled them to follow by their own natural powers. So to avoid Leibniz's charge that the operations of the force of gravity were miraculous and obscure, the young Kant felt the need of clarifying this crucial point. God might have given laws to nature, but for those laws to have prescriptive force, as well as for them to be able to explain their effects, laws must track the way in which natural powers act. God has bestowed the natural powers on things in nature and has also fixed the laws by which natural powers should abide. So the young Kant seems to be responding to Leibniz on behalf of God, that the operation of natural powers don't require God's intervention, although it is God who has ultimately implanted those natural powers qua real grounds in nature and has also given them laws to follow. So in this way, Kant gave his own solution to both the problem of nomological necessity and the problem of explicability. His solution consisted in populating nature with real grounds for the determination of a plurality of effects via natural laws. Kant's solution to the problems left open by the Newtonian picture then was to shift the burden of nomological necessity from God's legislative choice to nature itself by empowering nature with grounds, as real grounds, not logical grounds, for the determination of various effects. And once more, Newton's natural philosophy provided Kant with the examples he needed. So the necessity with which objects conform to the law of gravity is no longer downstream of God's legislative choice, but resides instead in the grounds-effect modal relation, whereby the same ground, gravity, may be causally responsible for a plurality of effect. Similarly, the elasticity of the air acts as a ground for a variety of effects in nature, from the generation of clouds to the maintenance of fire and human respiration. So these two fundamental forces of nature, gravity and repulsion, gravity and elasticity, act as grounds sufficient to determine a variety of effect. They act as real grounds which attach to the essence of things and determine their effects. So to sum up, this is Kant's solution to the three problems that the Newtonian governing conception of law seems to leave open. When it comes to nomological necessity, Kant would say laws govern nature by necessitating the way in which natural powers act. God might well have given laws to nature as his dominion, but laws of nature have prescriptive force by fixing the bounds within which nature's powers unfold and manifest themselves. For example, the law of gravity, while coming from God as a prescriptive force in and of itself, by fixing the bounds within which gravity as a natural power, or Kant calls it a ground, acts, by being inversely proportional to the square of the distance, for example, but directly proportional to the masses of the body. So laws govern by necessitating the universal and immutable relation under which natural powers or real grounds operate. Kant's solution to the problem of explicability again relies on the notion of real grounds. The notion of grounds involves modality and can be characterized in terms of necessity. The maintenance of fire is, for example, grounded in the elastic force as a real ground, as much as the spherical form of the earth is grounded in the attractive force as another real ground. And being grounded means that if the attractive force obtains, then necessarily the spherical form of the earth obtains. If the elastic force obtains, necessarily the maintenance of the fire obtains too. So how to understand the modal nature of grounding here may vary. It's a very complex issue that I'm not going to go into, but I just want to suggest here that the young Kant was effectively providing a causal reading of modality. The maintenance of fire is grounded in the elastic force in the sense that it obtains because of the elastic force. Similarly, the spherical form of the earth is grounded in the attractive force because it obtains because of it. And no wonder Kant calls grounds causes, and phenomena such as fire effects. So understanding the ground-effect relation in causal terms allowed Kant to explain the operations of Newton's two forces. Pace Leibniz, the operations of natural powers, such as attraction and repulsions, are not miraculous and they are not obscure either. By making attraction and repulsion real grounds, natural powers of objects, and by interpreting the ground-effect modal relation in causal terms, Kant was rescuing Newton from Leibniz's objection of having introduced occult, inexplicable qualities. Now, at this point, one may worry here that if this is Kant's solution to the problem of explicability, then Kant is dangerously closed to the godless Epicureanism, which Newton himself was a pain to avoid. And yet the worry can soon be deflated by noting how not only did Kant distance himself from what he called the blind necessity of Epicureanism, he also regarded the essential order of nature, constituted by forces of nature qua real grounds, as subsumed under God as the ultimate ground. That's the whole point of the 1763 essay, is a demonstration of the existence of God as the ultimate final ground. So there is an order of nature. The order is essential, is governed by natural powers, forces of nature as causal forces that determine a plurality of effects according to some sort of modal necessity, but that essential order is ultimately subsumed under God as the ultimate ground. So no charge of atheism could be leveled against Kant's solution. Finally, the problem of unity, again, we go back to the necessity of going beyond the Newton mathematical treatment of gravity that left wide open the issue of what confers unity to the contingent aggregate of phenomena. And so a metaphysical rather than a mathematical treatment was really needed to this effect. And Newton didn't provide one, as we heard this morning, Wolff complained and Kant complained after Wolff. So by introducing a one-to-many ground effect relation between gravity and all the aforementioned phenomena, or between elasticity and all the phenomena, Kant could defend the unity and the harmoniousness, fruitfulness, and beauty of the order of nature. So this is what Kant has to say at the end of this long passage in 1763 test. He concludes by saying, the forces of nature and the causal laws which govern them contain the ground of an order of nature. This order of nature, insofar as it embraces a complex harmony in a necessary unity, has the effect of turning the combination of much perfection in one ground into a law. Thus different natural effects are, in respect of their beauty and usefulness, to be regarded as subsumed under the essential order of nature, and by that means as subsumed under God. So against Newton's top-down governing conception of laws, the young Kant advanced, I want to suggest, a bottom-up governing conception of laws, whereby the essential order of nature, with its fundamental forces as grounds, comes first, and laws of nature govern by tracking the modal one-to-many relation between grounds and their effects. The prescriptive force of the laws originates, then, from the necessary unity of the order of nature, so understood as an order of natural events where forces act as grounds for the determination of their effects under laws of causality, while subsumed under God, and ultimately depending on God for its contingent existence, the order of nature enjoys also a degree of metaphysical autonomy from God and its operation. So Kant's God is no longer Newton's Lord God Pantocrator, governing his dominion with his immediate end. In its place, Kant has put the essential order of nature as mediating between the array of contingent natural events and God himself as the ultimate ground. This is the early pre-critical Kant of 1763. How he got to his mature view in the Critique of Pure Reason is another story that I'm going to tell some other time. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.